Jessica had always dreaded funerals. Something about the cold finality of death unsettled her more than it did most people. But when her friend Marie's mother passed away, she knew she couldn't avoid this one. Marie had been like a sister to her, and Jessica needed to be there for her. The funeral home was dimly lit, filled with the muffled sobs of mourning guests. The air was thick with the scent of lilies and roses, the overwhelming sweetness doing little to mask the unmistakable smell of death. Jessica could feel the weight of sorrow pressing down on her as she entered the room where the body lay in the open casket. Marie stood by her mother's side, pale and exhausted, her eyes red from crying. Jessica slowly approached, her feet dragging as if the air in the room had grown heavy and dense. The wooden casket gleamed under the soft yellow lights, and the body inside lay stiff and still. Marie's mother, once a vibrant and lively woman, looked like a hollow shell of her former self. Her face was drawn and gaunt, her skin pale, almost translucent. The makeup that tried to restore her lifelike appearance only emphasized the stillness of death. Jessica stood beside Marie, staring down at the body, feeling an odd chill crawl up her spine. The room buzzed with murmured condolences, but Jessica barely registered the sounds around her. All she could focus on was the body, the unnatural stillness, the pallor of death. Then, as if guided by some unseen force, Jessica's eyes were drawn to the face in the casket. Her heart seemed to stop when she saw it. The dead woman's eyes, once closed in the peace of death, were now open. Wide open. The irises, dull and gray, stared directly at her. Jessica's breath hitched. She blinked, hoping it was just her imagination, a trick of the dim lighting. But no, the eyes remained open, fixed on her, unblinking. A cold shiver ran down her back. She glanced at Marie, her friend still standing by her side, oblivious to what was happening. No one else in the room seemed to notice. Just Jessica. Her pulse quickened as she locked eyes with the corpse, a hollow gaze that seemed to pierce through her. The more she stared, the more something about the eyes felt alive, as though the dead woman was looking at her with purpose. Accusation. Hatred. Jess. Marie's voice jolted her from the trance. Jessica snapped her head away, her heart racing, and forced a weak smile. I need to use the restroom, she stammered, her voice shaky. Without waiting for a response, she hurried out of the room, her footsteps echoing through the quiet hallway. She pushed open the door to the bathroom and rushed to the sink, gripping the edge of the counter as she stared into the mirror, trying to calm her breathing. What the hell was that? She whispered to herself. Splashing cold water on her face, she tried to shake the unease gnawing at her insides. She leaned forward, gripping the counter tighter, her knuckles white. A soft creaking sound echoed through the empty bathroom. She froze, her heart pounding in her chest. She turned her head slowly, expecting to see nothing, just an old building making noises. But then she saw it. In the reflection of the bathroom mirror, behind her, the door to one of the stalls was slowly swinging open. The door, which had been firmly shut just moments ago, creaked wider, revealing the darkness within the stall. Jessica's breath caught in her throat. She felt the cold chill again, but this time it was different. This time, it felt as though something was breathing down her neck. She didn't dare turn around. Instead, she stared at the reflection, her eyes wide with fear. A shadow began to emerge from the stall. A figure, pale, hollow, stepped into view. The reflection in the mirror showed the same dead woman from the casket, her eyes wide, locked onto Jessica's. No, Jessica whispered, shaking her head as she backed away. This can't be happening. The figure's mouth moved, but no sound came out. It mouthed words, silent but clear. You can't escape. Jessica screamed and spun around, but the bathroom was empty. The stall door was shut. There was no one there. Her legs felt weak beneath her, but she forced herself to leave the bathroom, her pulse racing, her heart pounding in her ears. She could still feel those eyes on her, watching, waiting. She left the funeral early, making some excuse to Marie. She couldn't bring herself to tell her friend what had happened. It was too unbelievable, too horrifying. But the worst was yet to come. The next few days passed in a haze. Jessica returned to work, trying to convince herself that it had all been a stress-induced hallucination. Grief did strange things to the mind, right? But the feeling of being watched never left her. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw her, Marie's mother, staring back at her with those dead, empty eyes. At work, she tried to focus, but every time she glanced up, she saw them. On her co-workers' faces, her boss, the customers, they all had her eyes. Dull, gray, dead. They followed her everywhere, from the aisles of the grocery store to the parking lot at work. The more Jessica tried to avoid people, the worse it got. Their eyes bore into her, silently accusing her, blaming her for something she didn't understand. Soon, Jessica stopped leaving her house altogether except when absolutely necessary. She stopped going out with friends, stopped taking walks, stopped doing anything that would put her around others. Shopping, which had once been a source of joy for her, became a task she dreaded. She locked herself away in her room, the blinds shut tight, the door always locked. The once lively, vibrant woman was now a hollow shell, much like the corpse she had seen at the funeral. Her days became monotonous: work, home, grocery store, home. She no longer smiled or laughed, the world outside her walls was too terrifying. When she did have to go out, the eyes were everywhere. Faces of strangers all wore the same haunting expression, those accusing, lifeless eyes staring into her soul. She couldn't look people in the eye anymore. Not when she knew whose eyes they really were. One night, as she lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, she heard it again. The creak. Just like in the bathroom. Her heart raced as the door to her bedroom swung open, slowly, with that same agonizingly familiar sound. She didn't need to look. She knew who was there. The last thing she heard before everything went dark was the soft whisper of a voice she would never forget. "You can't escape." Jessica jolted upright, drenched in a cold sweat. Her room was dark and silent, but the whisper still echoed in her ears. "You can't escape." She sat on the edge of her bed, trembling, trying to shake off the nightmare. But deep down, she knew it wasn't just a dream. The figure of Marie's mother had been haunting her every moment since the funeral. The ghostly encounters, the unblinking eyes on every face she saw, it all felt too real. The guilt was eating her alive. She had been running from the truth for so long, but she couldn't run anymore. Marie's mother, Patricia, hadn't just died of natural causes. Jessica was responsible. It had started months ago. Jessica had grown close to Marie's family after years of friendship. Marie's mom, Patricia, had been a warm, inviting woman, always welcoming Jessica into their home as if she were one of her own. But Patricia had begun to grow ill over the past year. It was subtle at first, fainting spells, moments of confusion, a frailty that hadn't been there before. Jessica had visited often, trying to help Marie take care of her mother. But something about the way Patricia looked at her unsettled her. In the weeks leading up to her death, Patricia had seemed to grow suspicious of Jessica, watching her more closely than ever. There were even moments when she'd pull Marie aside, whispering to her with a wary glance in Jessica's direction. Then came that night, the night it all changed. Jessica had gone over to Marie's house after work to help with her mother's care, as she often did. But Patricia, already weak from her illness, had suddenly collapsed in the kitchen, her breath shallow, her face pale and strained. Jessica had been the only one there, Marie was out running errands. Patricia had gasped for air, her eyes wide with terror, clutching at her chest. Jessica had rushed to her side, panic flaring in her own chest, and fumbled with her phone to call for an ambulance. But as she knelt by Patricia's side, something had stopped her. In that moment, with Patricia struggling to breathe, Jessica remembered the cold words that Patricia had whispered to Marie the last time they had spoken. Patricia had warned her daughter, "Jessica isn't who she seems." Patricia had always been suspicious, watching Jessica with eyes full of judgment. The years of guilt and envy Jessica had suppressed boiled to the surface. Patricia had always made Jessica feel small, like she didn't belong, like she wasn't good enough for Marie's friendship. And now, as she knelt over Patricia's struggling body, a dark thought crept into Jessica's mind. She could end it. Her hand hovered over her phone, but she didn't call for help. She simply watched. Watched as Patricia's breaths grew more labored, her eyes filled with fear and confusion. Jessica didn't move. She didn't act. She just watched until Patricia's breath stopped altogether, her eyes still wide, frozen in a deathly stare. It had taken only a few minutes. The silence that followed had been suffocating. Jessica had finally called the ambulance, but by the time they arrived, it was too late. She'd told Marie that she had done everything she could. That it had happened so fast. And Marie, heartbroken but trusting, had believed her. But Jessica had never forgotten those eyes, the way Patricia had stared at her in those final moments. And now, those same eyes were everywhere. They were following her, haunting her, punishing her for what she had done. Jessica shuddered at the memory, her hands shaking as she reached for her phone. She couldn't keep living like this. The guilt was unbearable, the constant haunting a reminder of her crime. She hadn't intended for Patricia to die, not really. It had been a moment of weakness, of anger, but she hadn't acted, she had just failed to act. But the dead didn't care about intentions. The creak of the bedroom door snapped her attention back to the present. Her heart pounded in her chest as the door slowly opened, revealing the shadowy figure she had come to dread. Patricia stood in the doorway, her eyes, those horrible, unblinking eyes, fixed on Jessica. Her mouth twisted into an unnatural grin, lips pulled back in a grotesque sneer. "You." The figure rasped, the voice barely audible, like wind passing through hollow bones. "You let me die." Jessica backed up against the headboard, her breath quickening, her chest tightening with panic. "No, no, I didn't. I didn't mean to." The figure stepped forward, its feet dragging across the floor, the sound a sickening scrape against the wood. With every step, Patricia's form grew darker, the shadows clinging to her like a second skin, the room growing colder, more oppressive. "Why, didn't you save me?" Patricia's voice echoed, louder now, filling the room with its cold accusation. "I'm sorry." Jessica sobbed, burying her face in her hands. "I'm so sorry." The ghostly figure loomed over her now, its cold breath on her neck, the stench of decay filling the air. Jessica could feel those dead, accusing eyes burning into her, forcing her to relive the moment again and again. "You can't escape," the voice hissed, so close that it sent chills down Jessica's spine. "You'll never escape." Jessica screamed, curling up in her bed, her hands over her ears as if she could block out the sound. But the voice, those eyes, were inside her head now. They followed her everywhere, in her dreams, in every waking moment. Every face she saw was Patricia's, every pair of eyes carried the weight of her guilt. Weeks passed, and Jessica became a ghost of her former self. She no longer spoke to anyone, avoided every social interaction. She had become a prisoner of her own mind, unable to escape the haunting presence of the woman she had let die. The walls of her apartment felt like a tomb, closing in on her, suffocating her. The eyes were everywhere, on the faces of people in the street, on the television, even in photographs. No matter where she looked, they followed her, always accusing, always watching. One night, as Jessica sat alone in her room, the overwhelming guilt consumed her. The weight of her secret was too much to bear. She couldn't go on like this. She had to confess, to tell Marie the truth. Her phone lay on the bedside table, the screen glowing faintly in the dark room. With trembling fingers, she picked it up and dialed Marie's number. The phone rang once, twice, then clicked as Marie's voice came through. "Hello." Marie sounded groggy, as if she'd just woken up. "Marie." Jessica's voice cracked, tears streaming down her face. "I need to tell you something." "What is it, Jess? What's wrong?" It's about your mom." I didn't." Before Jessica could finish, the line crackled, and the cold, familiar voice came through the speaker, chilling her to the bone. "You can't escape." The phone slipped from Jessica's hands, falling to the floor with a dull thud. She sat there, frozen, as the voice echoed in her mind, louder, more insistent than ever before. Patricia's eyes were all she could see. Jessica stared at the phone on the floor, her heart pounding in her chest. The voice that had echoed through the line still reverberated in her mind, "You can't escape." It was the same voice that had haunted her every waking moment, the same voice that had driven her to the edge of madness. But she couldn't live like this anymore. She couldn't keep running from the truth. She picked up the phone, her hands shaking as she dialed Marie's number again. This time, she wouldn't let her fear control her. This time, she would tell Marie everything. The phone rang, and after what felt like an eternity, Marie answered. Her voice was groggy, filled with concern. "Jess? What's going on? Are you okay?" Jessica took a deep breath, her throat dry and tight. "Marie, I have to tell you something I've been keeping from you for too long." There was a pause on the other end of the line. Jessica could almost hear Marie's confusion. "What do you mean?" "Jess, you're scaring me." Tears welled up in Jessica's eyes as she finally spoke the words that had been choking her for months. "It's about your mom. The night she died. I could have saved her, Marie. I was there, and I didn't call for help right away. I don't know what I was thinking, her voice broke, I let her die." A heavy silence hung between them. Jessica could feel the weight of her confession crashing down on her like a wave, suffocating her, drowning her in guilt. When Marie finally spoke, her voice was quiet, barely above a whisper. "What are you saying?" I froze, Jessica sobbed, unable to stop the flood of emotions that came pouring out. "I was angry, and I hesitated. She was right there in front of me, struggling, and I didn't do anything. I'm so sorry, Marie. I never meant for this to happen, I swear." Marie cut her off, her voice shaking with disbelief. "You let my mom die? You were there and didn't call for help?" "I'm sorry," Jessica whispered again, her voice broken, barely able to form the words. Another long pause. Jessica could feel the tension, the weight of Marie's anger, her grief, her betrayal. She braced herself for the outburst, for the anger she knew she deserved. But instead, Marie sighed heavily, her voice softer now, laced with exhaustion. "Jess, why didn't you tell me this sooner?" "I couldn't. I was too scared. I didn't want to lose you, too." There was a long silence, and then, finally, Marie spoke, her tone steadier, but filled with deep sadness. "I don't know what to say, Jess. I'm hurt. Angry. But I also know that my mom was sick for a long time. Maybe it would have happened anyway." Jessica wiped her tears, her breath shaky. "I've been seeing her, Marie. Ever since the funeral, I've been haunted by her. I see her everywhere, her eyes, on everyone I meet. I can't escape it." Marie was quiet for a moment, absorbing the weight of what Jessica had said. "You've been punishing yourself, Jess. You've been haunted by your own guilt, not my mom. I don't think she'd want that for you. How can you forgive me after what I did?" Jessica's voice was a whisper, filled with the despair she had been carrying for so long. "I don't know if I can," Marie admitted, her voice strained. "But I know that holding on to this isn't going to bring her back. Maybe it's time for both of us to try and heal. Jessica let out a shaky breath, her heart heavy but somehow lighter than it had been in months. For the first time, the overwhelming weight of the guilt began to lift, even if just slightly. I don't expect you to forgive me, Marie. I needed to tell you. I couldn't live with it anymore. Thank you for telling me the truth, Marie said softly. I'll need time, Jess. But I don't hate you. I just need some space. I understand, Jessica whispered, her heart aching but hopeful. She hung up the phone and sat in silence, the room still, the air heavy with the aftermath of her confession. That night, for the first time since the funeral, Jessica slept without nightmares. When she woke up, the room was quiet, and the cold chill that had become a constant companion in her life was gone. She sat up, blinking in the soft morning light that filtered through the curtains. The oppressive weight of Patricia's presence was no longer suffocating her. It was over. She went through her day cautiously, half expecting to see Patricia's eyes on the faces of strangers, but there was nothing. The hollow, accusing stares that had followed her for so long had vanished. She even went to the grocery store and spoke briefly with the cashier. There were no ghostly eyes watching her, no cold whispers in her ear. As the days passed, the haunting presence faded further. The guilt that had once consumed her was still there, but it no longer manifested as a vengeful spirit. Patricia's eyes no longer stared at her from the shadows, they had been replaced by a heavy, lingering sadness. But it was a sadness Jessica could live with. She had finally told the truth, and while Marie's forgiveness was uncertain, Jessica knew she had taken the first step toward healing. Weeks later, Jessica found herself standing at Patricia's grave, the wind rustling the leaves in the trees around her. The sun was setting, casting a golden glow over the cemetery. She had come alone, unsure of what she would say or how she would feel. As she stood there, staring at the headstone, she spoke softly into the evening air. I'm sorry for what I did. I should have helped you. I should have saved you. I was weak, and I can't take that back. But I'm trying to make things right now. I'm trying to be better. There was no response, no whisper of cold air, no flicker of ghostly presence. Just the soft hum of the wind through the trees, the fading light of day. Jessica took a deep breath and knelt beside the grave, placing a small bouquet of flowers on the ground. She closed her eyes, letting the warmth of the setting sun wash over her, and for the first time in months, she felt peace. As she stood to leave, she glanced one last time at the headstone. Patricia's name was carved neatly into the stone, her life summarized in the brief dash between two dates. But Jessica no longer saw the cold, accusing eyes in her mind. She saw only the memory of a woman she had once known, someone she had wronged but would always remember. As she walked away from the grave, the weight that had haunted her for so long finally lifted, and for the first time, she felt free.